So here we go. I was born at a very early age in Portland area, and grew up for the first few years up through second grade in Portland. And I grew up in a Christian home, and my parents went to church every Sunday. When I was little, my dad was an elder at the church, and he led worship, and we were super involved. And I accepted Christ when I was really young, also. Like, I think I was either 4 or 5 years old, and I still remember it very clearly, but I was very young too. And I don't remember a ton from those years, except that my dad is a Vietnam veteran, and he had experienced a lot of really hard stuff. And when he came back from Vietnam, he got into alcohol when he was in Vietnam, and when he came back, he continued drinking, and it became a real big problem. But it was one of those where he was a really kind of a closet alcoholic, and he would be involved in church on Sunday, and then he would go to the bar afterward, and he'd be gone most of the day drinking. And it was one of those things that my mom was the only person who knew about this, and I don't remember anything about it as a kid, except when my mom finally gave my dad, when I was about 7 or 8, my mom gave my dad an ultimatum and said, "You need to either choose alcohol or your family." And so my dad said, "Well, I choose the family, but I got to get away from temptation." And so he moved away, and my parents were separated when I was 8. And my big memory of that was my mom just bawling, and me wanting to help her, but feeling completely helpless. And I just remember thinking my dad might be gone forever. So that was my first big low point that really hit me pretty hard. I At that point, my dad um, drove himself to Southern Oregon and out into the Siskiyou National Forest, where there were some gold claims up way up a gravel road that had been owned by his dad back in the Depression. And his dad had mined up there for several years, and so my dad went back up there. There was still a claim in the family, and my dad built a cabin by hand, and he literally cut lumber with a chainsaw by hand, and he built this entire home with $150 in materials. And after that summer, he got himself sober, and my parents got back together, and we moved down into that cabin with him. And we lived there for a couple of years off the grid. It was a 12-foot by 16-foot cabin, and the 4 of us lived in this little cabin. My mom cooked on a wood stove and all of this. It was an amazing time as a kid. I mean, it was like heaven as a boy, just living in the woods, being on the creek every day and climbing in trees, having adventures. And I don't want to steal Aaron's story, but this is where Aaron became my first good childhood friend. And he and his family were living out there too. And so that was a real high point for me, is being at the mine. And it was just a magical time. My parents really grew in their faith and in their relationship with each other. And my dad has remained sober to this day. He does have a casual drink once in a while, but God really brought healing through that experience. At some point, about 5th grade, we left the mine, and my parents decided it was time to get back to civilization and get us back in public school. And so through middle school, 5th grade through 8th grade, we moved around a little bit. We were in Eastern Washington and Colfax. Then we moved down to the Columbia Gorge in Stevenson, where my dad had grown up. And those were really, really hard years for me. After being completely free and being myself at the mine, I showed up at this school where I had no knowledge about music, about sports, about clothing, about anything. I was like the most socially awkward kid you can imagine. And I don't think that's an exception. And I immediately felt like an outsider. This was the 70s, so I can't say I was bullied, but today they'd say that probably. And I just always felt like kids were making fun of me, and I had no friends. It was a really hard time. When we moved to Stevenson, I was in 8th grade. I remember my first day, my mom picked me up, and I just cried. I just cried all evening, and I just felt completely lonely and rejected. And 8th grade was all that year for me. It was that way for me. Sports were the worst. I sucked at them. I knew nothing about the sports. Kids made fun of me all the time. but the one thing I could do is I was pretty good at school. And so I made some friends who basically got connected with me because they wanted to copy my homework and cheat off my tests. And so these were my friends in middle school. But I would say that I learned a lot writing this out this morning earlier, that I have some real deep roots of seeking acceptance that go back to this time. And that really played out over the following years. High school, I started making friends. I started growing and developing, and I kind of came out of my shell. And as I look back, all those years were about getting acceptance and trying to be popular, even though I was still not good at sports and things like that. I was still good at school. And so I really leaned into that. And I ended up, graduating with great grades, and I got a full ride scholarship to whatever school I wanted to go to. And I was class president, and I was the homecoming court, all those things, right? And so on the surface, things were really, really good through high school. And yet at the same time, I continued trying to find approval and friendships from others. It was like this unquenchable thirst. And so I got caught up in stuff too that I wasn't really proud of. The biggest thing, this is going to sound really stupid, but my friends and I got into driving around in the woods and doing vandalism. And we would break into like radio towers, and we would break into heavy equipment and drive it around. And we just did silly things like that. And another thing is I got my girlfriend when I was a senior. That relationship got really physical more than I wanted it to. And we ended up thinking she was pregnant near the end of my senior year. And so between that and almost getting caught in a major vandalism-ish deal that caused several $100,000 of damage, and I'm going fast here, I'm sorry. I kind of hit a point of crisis of guilt in high school. And right at the end of my senior year, I ended up fessing up to all this stuff to my parents because I didn't know what else to do. And it was the first time when, this faith I'd grown up with became like, oh, God will actually forgive this stuff. I have all these consequences to deal with. I may be a father. I may have to spend the next few years paying off a bunch of like damages that have been done. But God is forgiving me. And it was the first time that I really felt like, okay, this actually has real implications on my life, this faith thing. As it turned out, my girlfriend was not pregnant. As it turned out, the guy whose damage we did, we went to him and offered restitution, and he didn't require it. And so I really got off scot-free, and I was able to go to college. And in college, in high school, I had been a medium-sized fish in a really small pond. I went to a tiny school. In college, it was the opposite. Huge, huge pond, and I felt like just a number. And so college was hard. School was hard. I ended up kind of going through a string of relationships with girls. And after my high school experience, I swore off I wasn't going to sleep with any of these girls, but I allowed myself to kind of do everything else with these girls. And it kept feeding that desire for acceptance and being seen and important. And it was, in retrospect, I have a lot of regrets about the way I treated many of those girls, and a lot of broken hearts along the way, and things that I'm not proud of. And after college, I ended up being involved with the singles group for a few years in my 20s and leading that. Continued having kind of weird relationships with girls where it wasn't the healthiest thing. And a lot of them where they were into me more than I was into them. And it just ended up feeding this unquenchable thirst for acceptance that I keep identifying as this thread in my life. After a few years of that, and I was in my 20s, I discovered a few things I loved in those periods of time. One was sailing. I love sailing. It's one of my passions in life. And unfortunately, I don't live very close to water here. But during those years, I ended up taking a year off from work with the plan of sailing around the world. It was during that sailing trip that I met someone who knew Shannon, who I'm now married to. And so she ended up connecting us on a blind date. So that was a big deal. The other thing I discovered that is a huge love for mountaineering. And I got really involved in climbing mountains in the North Cascades of Washington and around Seattle area and that kind of thing. And so those were kind of big things for me. Meeting Shannon for the first time, everything changed. Well, I'm getting ahead of myself here. All these relationships I'd been in had been very self-serving and had been unhealthy. And I really felt like I was going through cycles of guilt where I just felt like, man, I've just used this girl and I'm just a worthless piece of crap because I'm in this pattern of using women to kind of make myself feel validated, make myself feel good. And I really kind of had this really awful perspective on myself and my own self-worth, and also my ability to have a healthy relationship. And so meeting Shannon was incredible. I think she was so different from any other woman that I had known that I immediately went into, oh my gosh, I want to protect this thing. I don't want to screw it up like I have other relationships. And so we made some commitments early on that we were not going to be, we didn't even kiss for like the first 3 months. Like we just didn't want to drop into those patterns and those habits. I also found that something that was really cool is I had gotten to where I had been successful in my career. I'd been successful in school. Like I had my first patent when I was still in undergrad, and all of these things were really important to me. I made more money than all of my peers, and that was kind of important to me. And Shannon could care less about that stuff. And it was really amazing to me, and it was really freeing to me. And it was the first time I realized I don't have to prove myself. I don't have to validate myself in these ways. And yet those are things that God has had to stomp down over and over through the years, basically a root of pride. And so that was a huge thing about getting to know her. And then seeing her and her acceptance of God's grace, because Shannon had been through a lot of really big mistakes and really hard times. And then her desire to serve other people. Like she was working at Union Gospel Mission serving homeless when I met her. Those were huge things that really kind of started to steer me in a healthier path from some of the first 20, 30 years of my life. After that, I quit my job as an engineer. I threw away all my textbooks and I said, I'm never going to work for the man again. I'm never going to be an engineer again. And I went into real estate with a friend of mine, and we started a real estate investing company. This was in 2003. And this was at the beginning of a really big ramp in real estate explosion. And it seemed like everything we did turned to gold. We would buy houses, we would flip houses. We had all these things going on, all these deals. This was with my best friend, Todd. And over time, that just continued growing until the point where we had enough passive income that we were able to retire at age 35. And I felt kind of on top of the world at that time. And that was in 2007. And 2008, the entire real estate market crashed. And suddenly everything that had turned to gold turned to something much less desirable. And we started losing properties. We started losing value everywhere. And something really hard is when my partner came to me with a legal form that said, I've just filed bankruptcy and you're holding the bag now on all the debt of all the stuff we have together. And everything was underwater, it was upside down, and it bled us completely dry. And over time, we had foreclosures, our credit was shot, we lost properties, and I just felt completely worthless as a provider, and a failure to my family, and a disappointment. When everything was going great, I'd actually borrowed $250,000 from my parents. I gave them I actually gave them the opportunity to invest with my business, is how I looked at it. And so they loaned a bunch of money. Suddenly I couldn't make payments to them anymore. And it was really, really hard. One of the lowest points of my life. At the same time, I skipped over, we had adopted Raven, and we had Parker a few months later. And that was a hard thing on its own, and I'm really trying to cut where I can here, where it makes sense. But Shannon and I went through some really hard times after having kids in our marriage. We kind of barely held it together for a couple of years there. And we ended up finding a counselor who helped us a huge amount. And basically, we can thank our marriage on Russ. He did such a great job of helping us to navigate a hard time. But having kids was really hard for me. I had to give up. I felt like I had to give up mountaineering. I felt like I had to give up sailing. I had to give up time from career. It cost a lot. Adoption is really expensive, and having kids is expensive. And honestly, I was kind of a jerk and looked at things that way a lot of times. But then in the middle of this financial crisis, God called us to adopt Georgia. And I won't go into that whole story. It's a huge miracle story on its own. But this was where I felt like, okay, Lord, we have no money. We have no idea how you're going to do this. And this was the first time when I really said, Lord, I'm going to trust you that if this is what you're calling us to do, that you're going to figure it out. And so things started coming in. We had to raise about $35,000 to adopt Georgia. And we were literally living in a camper trailer in a county park seasonally, and with 4 kids and a dog, and we were in a 19-foot 1970s trailer. And in the winters, we were renting a vacation rental that people couldn't otherwise rent in the off season. And it was a really hard time for us. And so as we're going down this road with Georgia, we have to pay bills as we go. And first bill was like $3,000 or $4,000. And then there's another bill for $5,000, and they get bigger. But what happened is I didn't even really notice at the time, but we kept getting these unexpected things. Like I got a letter from the insurance company one day, and it said, we just realized you've overpaid your insurance for the last 6 years. Here's a check for $4,500. And then we had a property that we had been hanging on to by a thread, and someone offered to buy it from us. And we got like $10,000 out of that. And we expected it was a complete write-off. And this just kept happening. And we ended up getting Georgia. It's a huge miracle story how she survived. She had open heart surgery and barely made it from China. But what I did was I just found it again this morning. I added up all of the expenses of that adoption. And then I added up all of the unexpected income that we had received. And it came out to within $150. Basically, God needed to make it so clear that when you look at, your income and your outflow on a spreadsheet, that he gave us $150 and covered all the costs for adopting Georgia. And this was stuff that I could not have foreseen or expected. And huge growing time for me, but also a time when I realized, man, I think I'm the provider for this family, but I am not. It is God. It's all God. And to give him the glory, but also to trust him with that, right? And to find freedom in that. So that's one of my biggest kind of chapters that I'm really boiling down for this morning. God humbled me through that whole time. Another way he humbled me is I ended up saying, I guess I am going to go work for the man again, and I am going to be an engineer again. And I sure wish I hadn't thrown away all those textbooks. So, so I got a job for In Situ in Hood River, and I was there for the next 15 years till just recently. It was an amazing season of growth for our family, amazing season of blessing from God. My mom and dad ended up forgiving all of that debt that I mentioned, that $250,000, which was a huge relief. I had a spreadsheet of when we were going to get out of debt, and it was when I was about 89 years old. And we were taking like half of our income and putting it to paying down debt every month. And I was like, it's going to be this way for the next 40 to 50 years. And Shannon's quote, which was amazing to me, is, we can live in a cardboard box as long as we have the Lord and each other, we're okay. And she's a woman with a lot more faith than me, and I've learned a lot from her. But I've also learned how trusting God brings so much provision and peace and blessing. And so part of it is my parents forgiving that debt. It was kind of a picture I needed of God's grace, kind of that unmerited favor and forgiveness of something that you can't repay, and just as a sheer gift. And so during this time, God called us through another crazy set of experiences to adopt Zeke. And I was like, oh, Lord, here we go. Like, now we're completely buried in debt. I have no idea how we'll do this. And yet this time, God had grown me to the point where I'm like, man, I'm excited. I saw this picture of this little boy, and Shannon and I looked at each other over dinner, and we just said, that's our son. We're supposed to adopt this guy. And so we did. And God provided financially through that as well. It was during the last 10 years or so, we started some other big things that happened is there's a theme of going to Baja, Mexico. And we started going there, probably 14 or 17 years ago. And we've almost gone annually as a family. And over time have built a lot of friendships and connections down there. We just love the country. We love the culture. And it's become a big part of our family's DNA. We've brought some groups down there, some short-term mission groups, and continue to go there. We'll be going with a group in just another month or so, including a couple of you guys. We moved a lot during this time. We were always trying to find the next rental. We were in, I think, 4 houses in Hood River. Then we lived in Parkdale. Then we went out to the Young Life camp, and we lived there as volunteers, and super cheap rent. We were able to attack that debt. And then we finally moved to Sisters, where Shannon kind of rebooted Young Life here. God really blessed that amazingly. We moved, I think, 4 times in Sisters, just hopping from rental to rental. And during all this time, we still had a couple of rentals left, and up in Seattle. And real estate had kind of recovered. It had been so long since the crash. And so with God's blessing, we were able to sell one of those rentals and move that money down here and buy a home. And this was about 4 years ago. And here we thought we would never own a home. And God gave us this crazy big home that was felt ridiculously large. And also there was enough money from the sale in Seattle that we were able to repay my parents for that debt that they had forgiven. And that just felt really good. I was always worried about my relationship with my brother, who I haven't talked much about yet, but my brother, we have a distant, hard relationship. And I was worried that the fact that basically I got this early inheritance by my parents forgiving debt would always be a dividing thing. But we were able to square that up. So it was a huge blessing. And then over time, God just has continued to bless us. And I just feel like so out of control of our finances, like it's just all God, and just trying to keep up with God the last couple of years. So last year we were able to pay off our house, and it had gone up a ton in value. And so when we were on our last Baja trip, Shannon and I were walking on the beach. This was just in March. And I said to Shannon, what do you feel like the Lord is telling you? And she's like, I think we're supposed to sell our house. And I said, yeah, that sounds right. So on the drive home, I called the realtor, and we had it ready, and it sold 24 hours after we listed it. We found the house we're in. It's about 60% the cost of the one we sold. And we got it just by writing a letter to the people. It's a house we had noticed and thought it was pretty neat and could be a good fit for us. And the people said, this has got to be a providence, is what they said. And they had just decided to move. And so just this summer, we moved into this much smaller home. And right now, I just feel like God is blessing us. He's just showering us with finances. And all I can think is this is God's ironic way of reminding me that it's all about him. It's not about me and my efforts and me trying to control things. But also I feel like there's some blessing for faithfulness, the little bits of faithfulness I've been trying to have. But also there's a challenge to take more steps. And so it feels like we're at a new point right now that we're about to turn the page on something. We're starting a small nonprofit with a bunch of the proceeds from the sale of our bigger home into our smaller home. And we feel like God's got something for us down in Baja in Mexico. And so we're just exploring that. Luke's going to be on the board of our little organization. So I appreciate that. I'm excited about that. And I feel like the Lord is calling me to switch to half-time in my job here in town. And so a lot of this is really scary, but it's really good for me to go over my story and just be reminded of how God has blessed us over and over. And for me, it's been letting go of pride. It's been letting go of independence. It's been letting go of the need for approval of others. And also I would say passivity is another thing. And so I feel like this is where the Lord's really calling me into working with more people, having more time for serving. Meeting with you guys is a big part of where I feel like God wants me to go next, and not just be an independent person reading my Bible on my own every day and calling it good. So kind of submitting to community of other believers is where God has us now as well. So that is my much longer than 15-minute summary, and I appreciate you guys listening to it.
Man, way to go, Doug. That is well done.
Oh,
Yes,
thank you.
Sharon, Doug.
Yeah,
Thanks for being so candid. It makes me terrified to go at some point.
Oh my gosh.
I wish I didn't have to go after you.
Oh man.
Yeah, thanks, Joe.
Jake.
Hey, speaking of,
I'm so excited to hear yours, Jake.
I think you did a lot of narrative on that, and I'm going to try to make this more narrative. I was just going to kind of breeze through this and go high points, low points, but I think the narrative is
hey, Jake,
an impactful
I
thing.
was going to say I probably did more narrative, and I didn't do a really good job just saying here's high points, low points. So just go with what you have.
I'll give you a little narrative. I'll give you the hybrid version of it.
Okay.
So I grew up actually not here in Oregon. I actually grew up in Southwest Michigan. And so that's kind of a lot of part of my story of growing up there. I grew up in a home not similar to Doug on that. I actually grew up in a non-Christian home. My parents were not believers, and I grew up in a very, very, very broken home. And I think a part of my story too is grew up with a lot of poverty, and we were poor. And I guess as a kid, I didn't really recognize it early on, but later it kind of showed it to me. But I grew up in a home where I really can't ever tell you I remember a day where my dad really loved my mom. They're the kind of people who ended up getting married just because my mom was pregnant with me. I'm an only child. And so kind of grew up with that, just in that very broken home. I mean, I have like vivid traumatic memories of physical abuse with my dad and my mom. And that really played a part with my relationship with my dad. And so my grandmother, my mom's mom, played a big part in this. She watched me a lot, and I mean, was one of the most faithful believers I've ever seen in life. She was a devout Catholic. I mean, this woman watched mass every day on TV when she wasn't at church. And so this, like, as a young kid, seeing this of wondering, what's this all about? Why are you so about this? What's that all about? So I think, yeah, massive low point for me is my parents fighting all the time. And then kind of moving on, and in grade school, just kind of school was not for me. Unlike Doug, it just was not my thing early on. Elementary, sure, but as I started getting into middle school, it's like, this is not me. And then as I was coming into middle school, I had some friends who invited me to this thing. Well, early on, I had a friend invite me to this thing called church, which I didn't know what it was. His dad was this thing called a pastor at a church. And I was like, he told me at Sunday school they had snacks, which is a massive motivator for me. And so I started riding my bike, and my parents, like on Sunday mornings, were like, you're riding your bike, you can go. And so started going to Sunday school, kind of hearing about this guy named Jesus. Just this message of hope. And so later on in middle school, some friends invited me to start coming to youth group with them. And I think that's kind of where middle school kind of tipped, where I met Jesus, and really, I think this message of hope um, and stability really echoed to me. It's huge. So I got into high school, and I realized in middle school and high school that like I didn't really know who I was, as many people in middle and high school know, but I realized that being the funny guy gets a lot of laughs, and you get a lot of so-called, as Doug used air quotes, friends, which I learned quickly that yeah, you get a lot of laughs, but it ends up getting in a lot of trouble. And so I sat in the principal's office a lot through those years, and kind of realized that wasn't me, right? Like I was kind of figuring that out. So another low point coming into high school, my grandma died going into my senior year. She passed away. She was 79, and it was really hard for me. She was a really just huge supporter of me, big believer, and just she was a stable person in my life. And she died right before I graduated high school, which was really hard for me. And through that, like the Lord gave me a dream the night that she, like the day after she died, of just her like talking to me and telling me it was going to be okay. Just surreal, like just an ultimate piece of just kind of going forward. And so I did graduate high school, and that was as far as my parents have ever gone on education. And so for me, it was dreaming about what was next. And so I did end up going to college, which was like a first for our family. Um, and going into college, so I went to college in a small Christian school in Indiana, just north of Indianapolis, and it was great. It was truly one of the best experiences of my life. Um, Met great people, got to play rugby all 4 years of college. Like I loved college. Some people hate college. I loved it. It was great. Um, and so kind of finishing high school, I really didn't care about girls. They were dumb. And then I got to college, and I realized that girls are you can be something to them. And kind of similar to Doug's story, that's when it really kicked off for me. I met a girl my freshman year. Um, we started dating. We got heavily involved. We were physically involved, and then during us dating through my freshman year, her mom passed away due to skin cancer, and our relationship wasn't healthy at all, and we ended up breaking up. And it was just like the most devastating thing for me. I thought I was going to marry this girl, because as you do at a small Christian college, the first girl you date should be the one you marry. I guess that's the messaging. Um, and she just, it wasn't a good fit, but it was like this massive breakup. And for the next 3 years of my college career, it was this girls can be a tool to like fill the satiating need to like be desired and be who I am. And unlike Doug and his college experience, I was like the big fish in the little pond. There's only a school of like 3,000 people. And so graduated college, and going into my senior year before I graduated college, I just was a train wreck, man. I was just making unhealthy decisions, drinking way too much, smoking, and just trying to fill a void. And then going into my senior year of college, I applied to all these places because I wanted to kind of have a fun summer. I thought I was going to be a youth pastor for the rest of my life. And I applied to one of these places that was out in Colorado. That was a dude ranch, where basically you get paid. Well, people pay a lot of money for you to go play cowboy for the summer. And during the interview, I thought I was going to work on maintenance. They were like, "That's great." And then they called me back and said, "Hey, we'd love to have you out, and you're going to be working with the horses this summer," which was eye opening for me because I'd never ridden a horse in my life. So, leading up to this, I say all that because like that working out at Lost Valley Ranch in Colorado was one of the most eye-opening experiences for me. One of the coolest experiences. It's a Christian-owned, Christian-run dude ranch that just taught me how to do ministry in like a whole different way. So I met Chelsea, my wife, out there when we first met each other. It was not love at first sight. We literally hated each other. I thought I was, this big, cool guy coming off of small Christian school, where I was just Stud Muffin McGee, and it couldn't have been anything less than that. And she wanted nothing to do with that. So I left. I went back and graduated college, which was like a huge part for me to like actually pursue a degree and finish it. And through this, during college, my parents actually finally divorced. It was this like really unhealthy thing where I just was begging my mom to divorce my dad because they needed to just get done with each other. They were separated, but it just needed to be finalized. Um, and so I graduated college, and I went back to the ranch in Colorado, and I worked there for about 4 more years full time, and it was some of the best experiences. Met people from all over the world. Um, Went back, and then Chelsea at the time was working for the cabin crew. She got moved to the group that worked with horses, which I was like, these girls, just the most sexist thing. Like, these women can't work with men; they don't know what they're doing. Um, and ended up like becoming really good friends. And then this ranch had a no dating policy, so we were like, well, maybe we're more than friends. I think I actually like you. And so we ended up deciding I was going to leave the ranch so that we could start dating. And so I took a job in Clarkston, Michigan, which is over on the side of Detroit. And we started dating. And then Chelsea eventually left the ranch and moved over to Clarkston, Michigan, which is just a really ugly part of Michigan. If you've ever been there, it's not great. And I started interning at a church as a youth pastor intern. The whole goal of that is like you do 2 years and then they place you in a church. Um, and it was one of the most unhealthy experiences I've ever been a part of. Just the youth pastor that was my mentor slash boss was like super touchy with the girls in the youth group. And it was just one of these moments in my life where I was like, I have to confront this guy as a young man. And I'm like, this is going to ruin your ministry and your career and your life. And so, yeah, I was there for probably about 6 months. And then just God was like, you got to get out. You got to go. You got to leave. And so I quit, and I never quit a job my entire life. So that was like really hard for me, but also knew super unhealthy. And so we, excuse me. So I called the ranch back, the ranch that I had worked at before, and basically said, I know you need a head wrangler, which was kind of this like God's grace in all this, because 4 years prior had never ridden a horse, and then took over managing a herd of 150 horses and 12 guys. So it was just this really neat thing where I went back to the ranch, and at the time we were not financially stable enough, and Chelsea stayed in Michigan for a couple months, despising me, which rightfully so. It was the worst winter in 40 years in Michigan. It was, and my wife told me, well, now wife, told me she hated the cold. I didn't believe her. And so eventually I had a shareholder from that ranch call me and ask me if he could actually just ride with her in her pickup all the way to Colorado to make sure she got back safely, which I told him that, Tom, you don't know anything about cars, but he informed me that he had money. So that was a good thing. And so when she got back to Colorado, I was like, I have to put a ring on this girl's finger. She doesn't think I'm the biggest idiot in the world. I mean, small idiot, but hopefully not the hugest idiot ever. So we got engaged, and at that time we ended up getting married 6 months later. And it was just this really like kind of, to echo Doug's story, Chelsea was one of the first people I've ever met who like was just different than other girls and just loved people intentionally and just genuinely doesn't do well with surface level conversations. And it really appealed to me. So we actually got married at that ranch in Colorado 10 years ago. And then we had the opportunity. My boss at the time said, hey, I've got this really good gig for you. We would love for you to just move down the road 2 miles down to work at this Jewish summer camp. And I outrightly told him, no, absolutely not. And then the whole gig was basically you had to deal with people for 3 years, and then the other 9 months of the year you had a 360-acre property to yourselves. Some people call that the shining. Some people call that like a huge blessing. So we did, and we worked there for 3 years, and we got to manage this property just by ourselves and our dogs. But we were two followers of Jesus as opposed to a staff of 200 people who were all Jewish, both Israeli and American Jews. I'm not going to waste a lot of time on those stories, but if you want some laughs, I've got a lot for you. So we did that for 3 years, and it was just this like really cool way to start our marriage, and just do life together. Not a lot of spouses work well together. Chelsea and I just do that well. Um, but we came to this point where it was like, is this unhealthy or is this good? And at the time we had found a church in Colorado. Like, I was burnt out of church. I wanted nothing to do with it. And it wasn't Jesus that I was burnt out from, but it was really just um, people. People had really screwed up, sinful, broken humans. And so um, that was really neat. That just restored everything where I'm like, church can be great. We want to be plugged in. I started helping out with a youth group. Felt like that has just been my calling through God, of just like being passionate about kids. And so towards the like 3rd year mark of working out there at the Jewish camp, it was like, it's time to go. Like, I think there's a fine line where as we matured, it was like, is this unhealthy or is this hard? And for a while it was hard, and we leaned into a lot of like having conversations with people. It wasn't this echo chamber of having a bunch of believers around you. It's like people that did not believe the same things we did. And so by year 3, it was unhealthy. It was time to go. And so Chelsea is from Central Oregon. She's from Powell Butte, Prineville area. And so when we were in Colorado starting to look in 2017, I got on Zillow and looked at Powell Butte, Oregon, and I asked my wife if she had an extra $1 million that I didn't know about to live in Powell Butte, Oregon. And so we moved back. Her mom was living in Madras, Oregon at the time, and we kind of lived in a camper trailer with them for a little while. But we moved back to Central Oregon because Chelsea's mom and not her dad, they were divorced, but her stepdad, Rick, owned this company in Oregon that we were going to take over. And so at this time, I was still not wanting to do anything with youth or anything. I was in the construction business. And so we moved back to take over the company, and that was in 2017. And so fast forward up to 2018, a low point in my life. We moved to Central Oregon, and September 19th of 2018, Rick, who was my boss and mentor and the guy I was going to take over his company, was actually tragically killed in a workplace accident when they were unloading his semi over in Idaho. And honestly, that's one of like the bigger, huge low points in my life where, I mean, literally, I just questioned God on everything of like, I thought this was it. I thought this was the goal. I thought this is what we were supposed to be doing. And God just during this time had said like, this is not what you're supposed to be doing. And it's just hard, just a really hard time of life for me. And it wasn't that long ago. And during this time, I had been getting back into volunteering with youth. I was helping out with Kirk County Young Life at the time. And there was this moment where it was just like, kind of like Doug said, I just felt like just this failure of like, how am I going to provide for my family? I'm supposed to be doing this. It was just Chelsea and I, we hadn't had kids yet. And devastating. And so I took a job with the county roads department, and I absolutely hated my job. Shoveling asphalt for 10 hours a day is absolute garbage. And I don't know why humans want to do that every day. It's not my thing. So literally, I say all that because one day we were out chip sealing right in front of the high school here in Culver. We'd bought a house in Culver because we couldn't afford anywhere else. And it's just the provision of God's like hand in all this, where I tell people I don't really listen to God in like the still small whisper. Like, I need massive red flags in my life. That's how God talks to me. He like waves them around. And so literally as we were like chip sealing in front of the high school in Culver, I was like, what if I started working at the school? Like, maybe that's what I should be doing in life, because this job sucks. And so I started applying, and I applied to 7 different jobs, and they told me no on every one of them, because it was like, is your background in teaching? No. I have a youth ministries degree. They're like, that's neat. That does nothing for public education. And so finally on the 8th one, well, the principal told me to actually stop applying, and they actually created a position for me. So persistence did pay off. And so I got a job at the high school, and yeah, it just this really neat thing where I started working in the school, just getting to meet kids, and I just like that passion, that desire, what I was created for. I just felt like God was like, this is what you were made for. And so during this time also, since we weren't doing life in Prineville, the area director before Bella, his name was also Jake. He was like, dude, I love you, but like, you're not doing what this is supposed to be in Young Life. Like, you're not there anymore. What would it look like to start Young Life in your town? Which was really overwhelming, but I feel like through God's like voice in this was like, yeah, this is what you should be doing. So 4 years ago, we did start Culver Young Life, and it's just been a wild ride since. And so kind of in this time, we had 2 kids. Hank is 3 and Lucy's 1. And 2 years ago, I just was doing way too much. And Chelsea's a very good truth teller in my life who let me know that I'm doing way too much. I said yes to everything at that time when I got involved at the school as coaching. I said yes to being the mayor of our town. That was stupid. Just all these things of like, I'm doing way too much. And my wife was like, you have kids now. Like, you've got to say no to these things. And so this last, just to kind of give you the last piece of this, is like, it's been a season of saying no to things and saying yes to what matters. And just kind of through this, like at the bottom portion, there's this like, what's this takeaway? What's this thing that you've gotten through this experience? It's just like, I just see the Lord's blessing in this, but I also see like my sin in a lot of this of like wanting to be accepted, but also this like growing up super poor. I realize now that like I want nice things, and sometimes that can be an idol for me. But I think like God's grace, provision, and just blessings, just heaping of it on our lives that I'm thankful for. So hopefully that didn't take terribly too long.
Yeah, that was
Try to
awesome.
give you this
Just about
the Spark Notes version of it all.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. Jake.
Thanks, Jake.
Thanks, Jake.
Did I miss something? You got Jewish blood, or what was the Jewish connection?
There's literally no ties to it at
Okay.
all. Jacob Schwab, I did learn through our experience, is like a very Jewish name, but that's not us. If I'm just being the like history buff, I think that our family lined on the other German Aryan side of things. Not great, but so there you go.
Jake, thanks. That was good. That was
Yeah.
like 15 minutes on the dot, I think, too.
Hey man, I tried to give you the Spark Notes version here, people.